Caleb Hartley had worked the Blackridge backcountry for 6 years, and in that time he had learned that the forest kept its own records. Game trails told him where the deer moved before the snow came. Broken branches told him where a bear had passed in the night. The forest never lied, not once, not in 6 years. That was why the missing persons reports bothered him so much. 3 hikers gone in the last 2 years. All experienced. All last seen near the eastern ridge, an area so remote that most maps simply left it blank. Search parties had gone in with dogs and drones and had come back with nothing. No gear. No bones. No trace. Caleb pulled his truck up to the gate at Station 12 that morning with a folder of old case files on the passenger seat. His supervisor, a tired woman named Dana, had asked him to do one more pass through the eastern ridge before the season turned. Bad weather was coming in fast, the kind that could close the roads for a week. He told her he would be back before dark. He believed it when he said it. By noon the sky had gone the color of wet ash. By 2, snow was falling sideways, driven by wind that screamed through the pines like something alive. Caleb checked his compass and his radio. The radio gave him static. The compass spun in slow, lazy circles, as if it could not decide which way was north. He kept walking anyway because stopping in weather like this was its own kind of death. It was near 4 in the afternoon, with the light already failing, when he saw the chimney smoke rising through the trees ahead of him. He stopped walking and stared at it for a long moment, because there was nothing on any map that should have a chimney. The eastern ridge was unincorporated wilderness. No cabins. No leases. Nothing. But smoke was smoke, and smoke meant warmth, and warmth meant survival. He followed it. The trees thinned out into a clearing he did not recognize, and there, sitting in the gathering dark like something out of an old photograph, stood a mansion 3 stories tall, built of gray stone, with windows that glowed warm and yellow against the storm. Ivy climbed one whole wall. A weather vane shaped like a running wolf turned slowly above the roofline, though there was no wind in the clearing at all. Caleb stood at the edge of the trees for a long time, snow collecting on his shoulders, and told himself that exhaustion did strange things to a man's eyes. Then the cold found its way through his jacket, and he stopped arguing with himself and walked toward the door. The door was oak, dark with age, with a brass knocker shaped like a wolf's head. Caleb lifted it and let it fall twice, and the sound rolled through the clearing like a dropped stone in still water. For a long moment nothing happened. He raised his hand to knock again when the door opened on its own weight, slow and silent, and a man stood in the gap holding a lantern. He was tall and thin, somewhere past 60, with white hair combed back from a sharp, narrow face. He wore a dark green smoking jacket that looked decades out of fashion, and his eyes, pale gray, studied Caleb from boots to badge before he spoke. "A ranger," the man said, as though confirming something to himself. "Out in this. Come in before you freeze, young man. Come in." "I did not know there was a residence out here," Caleb said, stepping past him into a wide entry hall lit by candles and a low fire. "This area is not on any park survey." "No," the man agreed, closing the door against the wind. "It would not be. My family built this house long before there was a park to survey it. I am Edgar Wren. This has been Wren land for 5 generations." He held out a thin, cold hand, and Caleb shook it out of habit more than trust. "Caleb Hartley, Blackridge Ranger Service." "Well, Ranger Hartley, you are very welcome here. No one finds this house unless the house wants finding, and tonight it seems to have wanted you." Edgar smiled, and it did not quite reach his eyes. "Come and warm yourself. The storm will own the night, I think. You will not be walking out of here until morning, at the very earliest." Caleb looked back once at the door, at the wall of white howling beyond it, and understood that the old man was right. He followed him deeper into the house. The hallway was lined with portraits, dozens of them, their painted eyes following him in the candlelight. Generations of Wrens, he supposed, though something about the later paintings struck him as wrong. The faces grew thinner toward the end of the hall. The eyes grew larger and darker, the jaws subtly longer, until the final portrait, the newest by the dust on its frame, showed a young man who did not look entirely human at all. "My son," Edgar said, when he noticed Caleb had stopped to look. "Thomas. He does not entertain guests anymore." He did not explain further, and something in his tone told Caleb not to ask. The sitting room was warm and smelled of wood smoke and old paper. Edgar poured 2 glasses of dark amber liquor and handed one to Caleb without asking if he wanted it. "Drink. It will put the cold back where it belongs." Caleb drank. It burned pleasantly and settled into his chest like a small fire of its own. "You said no one finds this house unless it wants finding," Caleb said, lowering himself into a high-backed chair across from his host. "What did you mean by that?" Edgar waved a thin hand. "An old family saying. Nothing more. We have always been private people, Ranger Hartley. The world moved on around us and we let it. There is comfort in being forgotten, if you know how to use it. There have been disappearances out here. 3 hikers in 2 years, all near this ridge. I do not suppose you have seen anything." Something flickered behind the old man's pale eyes, there and gone so quickly that Caleb almost convinced himself he had imagined it. "This forest has always taken its share," Edgar said softly. "It is a hungry place, Ranger Hartley. It always has been. I am sorry for your missing friends, truly I am, but I have seen no one out here but you, not in a very long time." He said it smoothly, and Caleb, tired and half-drunk on the strange liquor, let it go. It was some time past 9 when a sound rolled up from somewhere beneath the floor. A low, grinding thud, followed by a sound that Caleb's mind insisted, against all reason, was a growl. Edgar did not so much as glance toward the floor. "Old houses settle," he said before Caleb could ask. "The foundations groan in weather like this. You will get used to it." The sound came again, heavier this time, and somewhere beneath it Caleb thought he heard something else. A voice, maybe, or the memory of one. "That did not sound like settling," he said carefully. Edgar's smile did not move. "Drink your whiskey, Ranger Hartley. The storm will be loud tonight. Best not to read too much into every sound an old house makes." Caleb drank, but he did not stop listening. Dinner was served in a long dining room by an old woman named Marta who never once met Caleb's eyes. She set down a roast, dark bread, and a thin soup, and left without a word, her footsteps disappearing down a hallway Caleb had not noticed before. "Marta has been with this family since before I was born," Edgar said, cutting into the roast with slow, precise movements. "She does not speak much. There is not much left for her to say, I think, after all these years." "How many people live out here?" Caleb asked. "Myself, Marta, and Thomas, of course, though he keeps to his own quarters." "The basement," Caleb said, before he could stop himself. Edgar's knife stopped moving for exactly 1 second. "Thomas has been unwell for some time," he said, setting the knife down with great care. "A condition our family has carried for generations. It is easier for him, and for us, if he stays below, away from light and noise and strangers. I would ask you not to concern yourself with him." "Is he dangerous?" "He is my son." Edgar's voice sharpened just slightly, the first real edge Caleb had heard from him all night. "He is sick, Ranger Hartley, not a monster. I would thank you to remember the difference." Caleb let the subject drop, though his eyes kept drifting toward the floor, toward the place where the sound had come from, and toward a heavy door at the end of the hallway that Marta had walked past without once looking at it. After dinner, Edgar showed him to a guest room on the 2nd floor, a cold, narrow space with a single shuttered window and a bed that smelled of cedar and dust. "Sleep well," Edgar said from the doorway, lantern raised. "The storm will pass by morning, and you will be back to your work before you know it." He pulled the door shut, and Caleb heard the unmistakable click of a key turning in the lock. He tried the handle anyway. It did not move. Caleb did not sleep, not really. He lay on the narrow bed listening to the wind claw at the shutters and the house breathe and settle around him in long, slow groans. Somewhere past midnight, the sound came again, the same heavy thud he had heard at dinner, and this time it was followed by something that was unmistakably a voice. Almost a word. He got up and tried the window. It was shuttered from the outside, the wood old and warped but solid. He tried the door again. Still locked. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long while, turning the situation over in his mind the way he turned over a confusing game trail, looking for the part of the story that did not add up. A man does not lock in a guest he claims to be helping out of kindness. A man does not call his own son sick and then chain him in a basement. A man does not flinch, even for 1 second, at a simple question, unless the answer is something he is desperate to keep buried. Near 2 in the morning he heard footsteps in the hallway outside his door, slow and careful, followed by the soft scrape of a key. He lay back quickly and closed his eyes, feigning sleep, and through his lashes he watched the door open just wide enough for Edgar to lean in with his lantern, studying him in silence for a long moment before pulling the door shut again. The lock clicked. Caleb waited until the footsteps faded down the hall, then rose and pressed his ear to the door. He heard Edgar's voice, low and murmuring, moving away toward the stairs, and beneath it, very faintly, he heard that low growling thud once more, and this time the voice that followed it was clear enough that the hair on his arms rose. It said one word, broken and wet, like a man speaking around a mouth that no longer fit human words. It said, "Hungry." Morning came gray and pale through the gap beneath the shuttered window. Caleb heard the lock turn before the door opened, and Edgar stood there with a tray of bread and tea as though the night before had never happened. "Slept well, I trust," Edgar said, setting the tray down. "The storm has not let up, I am afraid. Quite the opposite. The radio says it will worsen through the day. You will have to be my guest a little longer, Ranger Hartley." Caleb thought of the locked door and chose his next words carefully. "I appreciate the hospitality, though I noticed I was locked in last night." "A habit, nothing more," Edgar said smoothly, not quite meeting his eyes. "Old houses, old fears. I lock doors out of long custom, not distrust. I apologize if it troubled you." It was a thin excuse and they both knew it, but Caleb nodded as though he believed it, because a man who shows his hand too early in a house like this one learns nothing at all. After breakfast, left briefly alone in the sitting room while Edgar attended to some business elsewhere in the house, Caleb rose and explored. He moved quietly down the hallway lined with portraits, past Marta, who was dusting a table and did not look up as he passed, and found the heavy door at the end of the hall that led, he was certain, to the basement. It was locked, of course, with an iron bolt newer and stronger than anything else in the house, as though it had been installed in this century rather than some earlier one. He crouched and pressed his eye to the gap beneath the door. Darkness. Stone steps disappearing down into more darkness. And far below, the faint shifting sound of something large moving across a floor, dragging chains that scraped stone with every step. He stood quickly when he heard Edgar's footsteps returning, and was halfway down the hall, hands in his pockets, by the time the old man rounded the corner. "Admiring the portraits again?" Edgar asked, his pale eyes flicking once toward the basement door and back to Caleb's face. "Just stretching my legs," Caleb said. Edgar studied him a moment longer than was comfortable. "Of course. Come, I will show you the library. It will pass the time far better than an old hallway." The library was the one room in the house that did not feel watched. Tall shelves climbed to a vaulted ceiling, packed with leather-bound books gone soft with age, and a fire crackled in a grate large enough to roast a deer. Edgar left him there with a cup of tea and the excuse of seeing to Marta about the midday meal. Caleb waited until he was alone, then began pulling books from the lower shelves, scanning titles, looking for anything that might explain the house, the family, the thing beneath the floor. He found it tucked behind a row of botany texts, a thin ledger bound in cracked leather, its pages filled with careful, slanted handwriting that changed slightly from entry to entry, as though passed down from one hand to the next over many years. The dates went back nearly 100 years. Dozens of them. Travelers, trappers, surveyors, hikers in the more recent pages. Beside each name, a short note in the same careful hand. Found at the tree line, half frozen. Given shelter. Lost on the Eastern Trail. Brought in before the storm worsened. 3 names in the last 2 years alone, each matching, word for word, the names from the missing persons files in Caleb's own truck. And beside every single name, no matter the decade, the same 4 words, written and rewritten down a century of handwriting. Fed to the house. Caleb closed the ledger slowly, his hands not quite steady, and understood, with the cold, settling certainty of a man finally seeing a trail clearly for the first time, that he was not the first guest this house had ever welcomed in from a storm. He was only the first one, so far, who had found the book. He heard Edgar's footsteps in the hallway and slid the ledger back behind the botany texts just as the door opened. "Find anything of interest?" Edgar asked, setting a fresh pot of tea on the side table. "Just looking at the books," Caleb said, keeping his voice even. "Your family kept quite a library." "We kept quite a lot of things." Edgar's pale eyes moved slowly around the shelves, lingering, Caleb thought, just slightly too long on the row of botany texts. Knowledge does not like to be thrown away, in my experience. It only likes to be hidden, sometimes, until someone is ready for it. The words hung strangely in the air, and Caleb wondered if the old man somehow already knew what he had found. "Mr. Wren," Caleb said carefully, "I think the storm may be easing. I would like to try the radio again. My supervisor will be worried." "The radio," Edgar repeated, as though the word itself amused him. "You are welcome to try, of course. Though I doubt you will find much luck. This ridge has never been kind to signals. It is part of why we have always been so very alone out here." He smiled, and for the first time the smile did reach his eyes, and what Caleb saw there was not warmth at all. It was something closer to hunger, carefully leashed. "I think," Edgar continued softly, "that you should rest a little longer, Ranger Hartley. You have had a long journey. There is no need to rush back out into a storm that has not yet finished with this ridge." It was not a suggestion. Caleb understood that clearly now, in the particular stillness of the old man's face, in the way Marta had appeared silently in the doorway behind him, blocking the only way out of the room. He smiled back, and said that rest sounded fine, and felt, for the first time since he had stepped through that oak door, genuinely afraid. That night, Caleb did not wait to be locked in. As soon as Edgar's footsteps faded down the hall, he tested the door and found, to his quiet surprise, that it was not locked at all. Either the old man had grown careless, or he no longer felt the need to bother. Neither possibility comforted him. He slipped into the dark hallway and made his way toward the basement door, moving past the portraits whose painted eyes seemed, in the low light, to track him all the way down the hall. The iron bolt was thrown but not locked, and his hand hovered over it for a long moment before he drew it back and eased the door open. Cold air rushed up to meet him, carrying with it a smell of damp stone and something else beneath it, something animal and unwashed. He took the small flashlight from his jacket and started down the steps. The stairs went on far longer than the house above should have allowed, curving downward into a wide stone chamber lit by a single guttering lantern. Chains were bolted into the far wall, thick iron links disappearing into a heap of straw and old blankets in the corner. And in that corner, something moved. It rose slowly out of the shadows, taller than any man, covered in dark matted fur, with hands that ended in long curved claws and a face that was, impossibly, agonizingly, still half-human beneath the muzzle that had grown over it. Its eyes, when they found Caleb's light, were not the flat animal eyes he had braced himself for. They were wet and intelligent, and full of something that looked almost like recognition. "Thomas," Caleb said softly, the name slipping out before he had decided to say it. The creature's chained hand twitched, and from its throat came a low, broken sound that was not quite a growl, and not quite a word, but was trying, with everything it had left, to be one. Caleb stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs as the creature strained against its chains, not lunging, he realized after a moment, but reaching, one massive clawed hand stretched toward him, trembling with the effort of holding itself still. "I am not going to hurt you," Caleb said quietly, though he had no idea if the words meant anything to whatever was left of the man inside that body. "I found your name in a book upstairs. Thomas Wren." The creature's head tilted at the sound of its own name, and a low whine escaped it, thin and almost childlike against the size of the body producing it. "What did your father do to you?" Caleb whispered. A floorboard creaked at the top of the stairs. "He did not do anything to me," Edgar said from the doorway, lantern raised, his voice flat and cold in a way Caleb had not heard from him before. "This is what our blood does, Ranger Hartley. It has always done it, generation after generation. I did not curse my son. I only chose, when his time came, to keep him fed rather than let him starve and turn that hunger loose on every soul within 50 miles. By feeding him people," Caleb said. "Hikers. Trappers. 3 hikers in the last 2 years alone." Edgar's face did not change, though something in his pale eyes finally cracked open, just slightly, into something almost like grief. "The forest takes its share regardless, Ranger Hartley. I only decided long ago that it was kinder to choose how, and to make certain my son did not have to hunt for it himself, like an animal. I am not proud of what this house has become, but I have kept this thing contained for 40 years. Without me, it would already be loose across this entire range." "He is not a thing," Caleb said, looking back at Thomas, at the wet, pleading eyes still fixed on him. "You said so yourself. He is your son." "He is both," Edgar said quietly. "That is the tragedy of it. And tonight, Ranger Hartley, I am very sorry to say that he is also hungry, and you are the only meal this storm has brought me in quite some time." Edgar's hand came up from behind the lantern holding a long iron rod, and Caleb understood, far too late, that the old man had not followed him down here by accident. "You knew I would come down here," Caleb said, backing toward the wall, putting distance between himself and both of them. "I left the door unlocked," Edgar said simply. "Curiosity is a very reliable trait in young men, Ranger Hartley. I have used it before." He raised the rod and struck, fast for a man his age, and Caleb barely got his arm up in time to take the blow on his forearm instead of his skull. Pain exploded white through his vision as he stumbled back against the cold stone wall. Behind him, the chains rattled violently, and Thomas's voice rose into something between a roar and a scream, straining against the iron bolted into the wall. "Be still," Edgar snapped at his son, not even glancing back, and raised the rod again over Caleb. Caleb did not wait for the second blow. He drove forward and low, the way he had been trained to take down a man twice his size, and caught Edgar hard across the knees. The old man went down with a cry, the rod clattering away across the stone floor, and Caleb scrambled for it on hands and knees, snow boots sliding on the damp stone. He got his hand around the cold iron just as Edgar's fingers closed around his ankle, surprisingly strong for a man his age, dragging him backward across the floor toward the chains. "He needs to eat," Edgar hissed, no longer calm, no longer composed, something wild and desperate breaking through the careful surface he had worn all evening. 40 years I have fed him. 40 years I have kept this house standing on nothing but careful choices, and I will not let one ranger undo all of it in a single night." Caleb twisted, kicked free, and came up swinging the iron rod, not at Edgar, but at the heavy padlock holding the chain bolted to the wall. The padlock did not break on the first strike, or the second, but on the third it gave with a crack that echoed through the stone chamber like a gunshot. Thomas surged forward the instant the chain went slack, and Edgar's scream of fury turned, in half a second, into something closer to terror. "No," he shouted, scrambling backward across the floor. "No, you do not understand what you have done. He has not fed in days. He will not know the difference between us. He will not." Thomas did not move toward Caleb at all. He turned, slow and deliberate, his wet, half-human eyes fixed on his father, and 40 years of chains and darkness and careful, terrible choices seemed to pour out of him at once in a sound that was not animal and was not human, but was something in between, something that had been waiting a very long time to be heard. Caleb backed toward the stairs, rod still in hand, and watched Edgar press himself against the stone wall as his son advanced on him with slow, heavy steps. "Thomas," Edgar said, his voice cracking into something small and old and frightened. "Thomas, please, I only ever did this to protect you, to protect everyone I never wanted." Whatever he never wanted was lost beneath the sound of chains dragging across stone, and Caleb, halfway up the staircase now, made a choice he would turn over in his mind for years afterward. He did not run. He turned back, into the cold and the dark and the smell of old blood, and shouted the only thing he could think to shout. "Thomas!" Look at me. Look at me, not him. The creature's head turned, slow and trembling, away from the cowering shape of his father and toward Caleb on the stairs. He kept you in chains for 40 years, Caleb said, keeping his voice as steady as he could manage with his heart slamming against his ribs. He fed you people who never asked to be part of this. But killing him in this basement does not free you from any of it. It only finishes what he started. You will still be down here in the dark. Thomas's clawed hands flexed at his sides, and for a long, terrible moment Caleb thought the words had meant nothing at all, that there was no longer enough of the man left inside that body to be reached by anything so small as reason. Then the creature's shoulders sagged, just slightly, and the low growling sound in his throat softened into something almost like a sob. Edgar, sensing the moment shift, scrambled for the stairs on hands and knees, shoving past Caleb hard enough to send him stumbling against the wall. "Bolt the door," the old man gasped, hauling himself upright on the steps. "Bolt the door behind us, quickly, before he—" But Thomas was already moving, and not toward his father. He moved past both of them, slow and heavy and deliberate, toward the narrow stone passage at the back of the chamber that Caleb had not even noticed in the dark, a passage that led, he would later learn, to a door cut into the hillside far from the house, a door Edgar had built decades ago for exactly this possibility and had hoped, desperately, to never need. Edgar did not chase his son into the dark. He stood frozen on the stairs, lantern shaking in his grip, watching the passage where Thomas had disappeared with an expression Caleb could not name, grief and relief and terror all tangled together into something that looked, more than anything, like a man finally watching the weight of 40 years walk out of his hands. "He will hunt now," Edgar said quietly, almost to himself. "Without me to feed him, he will hunt, and this entire ridge will not be safe again, not for years. Maybe that is not yours to control anymore," Caleb said. Edgar turned on him with something close to fury. "You do not understand what you have done. You have undone 40 years of careful, terrible work in one reckless night, Ranger Hartley, and you will not be the one who has to live with what comes of it." "No," Caleb agreed. "But neither will the next hiker you would have fed him, if I had not come down here." Edgar had no answer for that. He simply stood on the stairs, old and small and suddenly very tired, the lantern light trembling across his narrow face. "You should leave," he said finally, "while the storm allows it. There is nothing left here for you to find." "There is a ledger in your library with my name about to be added to it," Caleb said. "I think I will be deciding for myself when I leave." Something in Edgar's face shifted at that, a calculation moving behind his pale eyes, and Caleb understood, with the same cold certainty he had felt reading the ledger, that the old man was not finished trying to control how this night ended. Edgar moved first, faster than Caleb expected from a man his age, slamming the basement door shut and throwing the bolt before Caleb could reach the top of the stairs. The lock clicked into place, and Caleb was alone in the dark stone chamber, the cold air settling around him like a held breath. He climbed the stairs anyway and pounded on the door, more out of frustration than any real hope that it would open. "You will stay down there," Edgar's voice came through the wood, strained and unsteady, "until I have decided what is to be done with you. I am sorry, Ranger Hartley. I gave you shelter from a storm, and you repaid me by destroying the only balance I have managed to keep in this house for 40 years. I cannot simply let you walk back out into that forest now, not with what you know." "You are talking about killing me," Caleb said flatly. A long silence answered him. "I am talking," Edgar said finally, "about doing what this family has always done when a guest sees too much." Caleb turned from the door and surveyed the chamber with new eyes, no longer a frightened guest but a man calculating an escape. The narrow passage where Thomas had vanished was still there, cut into the back wall, dark and uninviting but undeniably a way out that did not run through the locked door above. He picked up the iron rod from where it had fallen, and the small flashlight from his pocket, and walked toward the passage, into the dark his host so badly wanted him to stay out of. The passage was narrow and low, forcing Caleb to stoop as he moved through it, his flashlight beam catching claw marks scored deep into the stone walls, decades of them, layered over each other like rings in a tree. The air grew colder the further he went, and somewhere ahead he could hear the storm again, fainter now, but unmistakably the sound of wind moving through trees rather than around stone. The passage opened, after what felt like 100 yards, into a narrow cleft in the hillside, snow blowing sideways through the gap, and beyond it, the dark shapes of pine trees stretching away into the storm. He was outside. He had not expected the relief of it to hit him as hard as it did, cold air biting his face, the open sky somehow a comfort even buried beneath storm clouds. Movement caught his eye at the tree line, a large dark shape pacing back and forth at the edge of the clearing, not fleeing into the deeper forest as Caleb might have expected, but circling, restless, as though caught between the pull of the wild beyond and something behind him that would not let him fully leave. Thomas had not run far at all. Caleb stepped out of the cleft slowly, hands open, the iron rod left behind in the passage, and the creature's head turned toward him immediately, ears, or what passed for ears beneath the matted fur, swiveling forward. "I am leaving," Caleb said quietly into the wind. "I do not think your father is going to let me leave easily. I do not suppose you would help me with that." The creature that had once been Thomas Wren considered him for a long moment with wet, intelligent eyes, and then, slowly, turned and began walking back toward the house. Caleb followed at a careful distance, circling around through the trees to the front of the house rather than risk the passage again, and found the front door standing open, swinging slightly in the wind, lantern lights spilling out across the snow. Inside, he found Edgar in the entry hall, frozen halfway between the stairs and the door, his pale face turned up toward the second-floor landing where Thomas stood, fully framed in lantern light for the first time, massive and dark and utterly still. "You should not have come back here," Edgar said, though it was unclear in that moment whether he was speaking to his son or to Caleb. "This is still his house too," Caleb said, stepping in out of the storm, snow melting off his shoulders onto the old wood floor. "You do not get to decide alone anymore what happens in it." Edgar's eyes flicked between them, calculation and fear and something that might, beneath all of it, have still been love, warring openly on his face for the first time since Caleb had met him. "I built that bolt into the basement door to keep him safe," Edgar said, his voice cracking. "Safe from hunters. Safe from a world that would put a bullet in him the moment they saw what he had become. Everything I have done, every guest I ever fed to him, I told myself it was the smaller cruelty. I told myself the world owed him that much, after what it did to our blood generations ago. Maybe it is time to stop deciding what the world owes him," Caleb said, "and start asking him what he wants." On the landing above, Thomas began, slowly, to descend the stairs. Edgar backed away from the staircase, lantern shaking in his grip, as his son's heavy footsteps came down one step at a time, claws clicking softly against old wood. "Thomas," Edgar said, his voice smaller than Caleb had heard it all night, "whatever you intend to do, please, just let me explain, let me." Thomas stopped 3 steps from the bottom, towering over both of them in the lantern light, and for a long moment the only sound in the entry hall was the storm outside and the old man's ragged breathing. Then, slowly, the creature's head turned toward Caleb instead of his father, and the broken, half-formed sound came again from deep in his throat, the same word Caleb had heard through the locked door the night before. Not hungry, this time. Caleb listened closer and understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the storm, that the word had changed. "Help," Thomas said, the syllable mangled and wet but unmistakable, dragged up from somewhere deep beneath 40 years of fur and silence and chains. Edgar made a sound like something breaking inside his chest. "He has not spoken in 20 years, the old man whispered. "Not since the change took the last of him. I thought that part of my son was already gone." "Maybe it was just waiting," Caleb said quietly, "for someone to let him out long enough to try." Edgar sank slowly onto the bottom step, the lantern set down beside him, his whole body seeming to collapse inward under the weight of 2 decades he had clearly believed were already over. "I do not know how to undo what I have done," he said, to no one in particular. 40 years of feeding this house, and I do not know if there is a version of tomorrow where any of us walk away from this clean." "There is not," Caleb said honestly. "There are 3 families out there who are owed answers about people they lost. There is a ledger in your library that proves it. None of that gets undone by anything that happens here tonight." Edgar flinched at that, but did not argue. "What I can tell you," Caleb continued, is that it does not have to keep happening. Your son does not have to stay chained in a basement to keep this ridge safe, and you do not have to keep deciding who gets fed to him to keep your family's secret. There are people, real people, who study things like this, who might be able to help him, or at least help him more than 40 years in the dark ever did. The world will not see a man worth helping, Edgar said bitterly. It will see a monster, and it will put him down the moment it gets the chance, and you will not be able to stop that any more than I could. Maybe, Caleb admitted, but that is his choice to weigh now. Not just yours. Above them, on the stairs, Thomas made a low sound that was almost, impossibly, something like agreement. It was Marta who broke the silence that followed, appearing in the hallway doorway with an expression Caleb had not seen on her once during the entire visit, something fierce and tired and finally finished with waiting. I told you, Edgar, she said quietly, 20 years ago, when he stopped speaking, that this house was killing more than the people you fed it. It was killing him too, piece by piece, in that basement. You did not listen then either. Edgar looked up at her, old and gray and entirely without the cold composure he had worn all evening. What would you have had me do, Marta? Let him loose on the world the moment the change took him? Let hunters put him down in some field for the local paper to write about? I would have had you ask him, Marta said simply, instead of deciding everything alone, in the dark, for 40 years. Thomas descended the final 3 steps slowly, and Edgar flinched as his son passed within arm's reach of him, but the creature did not so much as glance at his father. He moved instead toward the open front door, toward the storm and the dark trees beyond it, and stopped at the threshold, his massive shoulders silhouetted against the snow. He turned his head back, once, toward Caleb. Help, he said again, clearer this time, the word costing him visibly less than it had the first time. I will, Caleb said. I promise you that. But it has to start with you choosing to walk back through that door, not run from it. What happened next, Caleb would spend a long time trying to put into words that anyone might believe. Thomas stepped back from the threshold into the entry hall, and stood there trembling, fur and claw and ruined human face all caught together in the lantern light, and slowly, terribly, he sank down onto the floor, not as an animal might collapse, but the way a man sinks down when he has been standing under an unbearable weight for far too long and has finally been allowed to set it down. Edgar moved toward him without thinking, the way a father moves toward a child regardless of what that child has become, and this time Thomas did not pull away. The old man knelt on the floor beside his son, both of them shaking, and the sound that filled the entry hall was no longer a growl or a snarl but something closer, impossibly, to weeping, from a throat that had not been built to make such a human sound in 20 years and was trying anyway. Marta stood in the doorway with her hand pressed to her mouth. Caleb stayed where he was, by the open door, the storm howling at his back, and understood that he was witnessing the end of something that had been building, quietly and terribly, for 40 years, long before any hiker had ever gone missing on the eastern ridge. He did not know yet whether it was an ending that would let any of them walk away clean. But for the first time since he had knocked on that oak door, it felt, at least, like an ending that belonged to all of them, rather than to one old man's careful, terrible secret. The storm broke sometime before dawn, the wind dying down to a low murmur, the snow thinning until pale gray light began to filter through the tall windows of the entry hall. Caleb had not slept. He had spent the night keeping watch by the open door, the iron rod within reach though he no longer believed he would need it, while Edgar sat on the floor beside his son until exhaustion finally took the old man where he sat. When morning came fully, Thomas was gone. Not vanished into the storm, Caleb understood when he found the note left on the entry table in handwriting that was clearly Marta's, but moved, with great care, into a quieter room at the back of the house, away from the basement entirely, where Edgar intended to keep him as something closer to a patient than a prisoner, at least until they could find someone willing to help him properly. It was not a clean resolution. Caleb understood that even as he read the note. A man could not undo 40 years and 100 names in a ledger with one long night of grief on a hallway floor. There would be authorities to involve, families to answer to, questions that no apology from Edgar Wren would ever fully satisfy. But it was, Caleb thought, walking out through the front door into pale morning light and clean fallen snow, A beginning, at least, in a house that had not had one in a very long time. He found his pack where he had left it by the gate, and his compass, when he checked it again, pointed steady and true toward the south, toward the ranger station, toward a world that was about to receive a report unlike any Caleb Hartley had ever filed in 6 years on this ridge. It took him most of the day to walk out, the storm having reshaped the trails into something nearly unrecognizable, and by the time he reached Station 12, Dana was already organizing a search party, certain after 2 missed radio checks that she had lost a ranger to the same ridge that had swallowed 3 hikers before him. She did not believe him at first. Not the mansion, not the ledger, not the thing in the basement that had once been a young man named Thomas Wren. Caleb did not entirely blame her. He had lived it, and even he found himself doubting parts of it in the telling, the way a nightmare loses its sharp edges the moment daylight touches it. But the coordinates he gave led a team back to the clearing, and the clearing, when they reached it, held something that made every doubting officer go quiet. The house was still there. Older than it had seemed in the storm, the stone weathered and cracked in places that had looked smooth and whole by lantern light, the ivy on the walls thicker and more tangled than Caleb remembered, as though the building had aged decades in the handful of days since he had walked out of it. Edgar was found inside, calm and resigned, ready, it seemed, to finally answer for 40 years of careful, terrible choices. Marta was found beside him. Thomas was found in the quiet back room exactly where the note had said he would be, sedated under Marta's careful watch, no longer chained, his half-human eyes tracking Caleb's face the moment he stepped into the room, and in them, unmistakably, something that was not hunger at all. It looked, more than anything, like gratitude. The story that eventually made its way into official reports was carefully, deliberately incomplete. A reclusive family. A series of tragic incidents over many years. A father finally cooperating with authorities after the disappearance of a park ranger forced the issue into the open. The word werewolf did not appear in a single document, though Caleb knew that every investigator who had stood in that basement and seen the chains, the claw marks, the ledger of names stretching back a century, carried the truth of it home with them regardless of what they were willing to write down. Edgar was charged, eventually, with crimes that the legal system had no good framework for, given that most of his victims had vanished without bodies, without evidence beyond a careful, slanted handwriting confessing to things no court had ever been asked to prosecute before. Caleb testified to what he had seen. He did not know, in the end, what became of the case, only that Edgar Wren spent what remained of his life somewhere far from the eastern ridge, and that the house itself was eventually condemned and fenced off, too remote and too strange for anyone to know quite what else to do with it. Thomas was moved to a research facility 2 states away, a place that specialized, Caleb was told carefully, in conditions without a name, where Marta insisted on going with him, the only family he had left who had ever once asked him what he wanted rather than deciding it for him. Caleb visited once, almost a year later. Thomas could speak in full sentences by then, slow and careful, like a man relearning a language he had once known fluently. He thanked Caleb for the door he had opened that night, both the basement door and the one in the front hall, and for staying long enough to listen to a single broken word that had cost him everything to say. Caleb still walks the Black Ridge backcountry. He took a long leave after that winter, and there were months where he was not certain he would go back out into those trees at all, but in the end the forest was still the forest, and a man who runs from one bad night in the woods tends to lose the only life he ever really wanted. He still checks his compass twice on every long patrol now, out of habit more than need. He still pulls maps before he leaves, comparing every line against the eastern ridge, though the clearing where the house once stood shows up on no survey, even now, even after everything. Sometimes, on quiet nights at Station 12, with the wind moving through the pines outside, he thinks about the word that cost Thomas Wren so much to say, and about all the names in that ledger who never got the chance to be heard at all, and he tells himself that the forest does keep its own records after all, even the ones written in chains and silence and 100 years of careful, terrible choices. He has not found another house that should not exist. He does not expect to. But 6 years became 7, became 8, and Caleb Hartley still walks out past the tree line every season the snow allows it, because some debts, he has come to believe, are best repaid by simply staying, by continuing to look closely at a forest that has never once, in all his years on this ridge, told him a lie he was not willing to listen for. And on the nights the wind sounds almost like a voice, he still listens, just in case it is finally asking for help, rather than simply for him.